During the season of Lent, there is a practice that is exercised by most Christians around the world. And what is that commonly practiced exercise? What is it? It's fasting, right? Yes, it's fasting. What is fasting? Not eating, sure. Not eating is a part of fasting, but what is fasting in and of itself? Denying yourself, that's way too deep. That's way too deep. Yeah, what is fasting? Here, so look at the screen. I have a definition for you. Fasting is abstaining or keeping yourself from something in your daily life in order to give more of your attention to God. Okay? Now, some of the common practices of fasting, all right, younger Christians, you might practice fasting by abstaining from social media, right? Some of you guys might shut down your Facebook account. Some of you guys might, disable your Instagram or your Snapchats, the notifications or whatnot. Other people will fast from food. They'll fast from eating unhealthy foods, or they'll fast from eating foods entirely, like a whole day's worth of meals. Rather than eating, they would rather give their time and pray and fast and give their attention to God. Some other practices of fasting, we have abstaining from devices such as your smartphones or your tablets or your computers and whatnot. And just to share with you, I think I shared this a number of years ago with you guys before, but when I was your age in high school, I believe I was in grade 9 at the time because I wasn't thinking deeply yet. And I remember one time my sister, for our spring break, we had a youth spring break, and our youth group went to this retreat center, and we're just doing this, and my sister made a covenant for each of us. And so they were like, you should fast from something. And at that time, computers were just getting big. We had our, modems coming out. I know you guys have fast cable speed modems, but ours back then used to be those little machines that would communicate to the internet and say, it took us like a minute to get onto the internet. And like your computer would like communicate with the internet and say, hey, can I get online? And the computers, the internet's like, oh yeah, maybe, there's a lot of other computers. And so it would take a while. And I used to be on the computer quite a lot playing older games, okay? not what's it called? Counter-Strike? Not any of that, but just older games. And so my sister thought, Josh, she came up to me personally and she said, Josh, you should fast from your computer because you're on it too long. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure. And for me at that time, when I was your guys' age, I didn't know that there was actually a Lent season. I thought this fasting and that Lent was just during our spring break. And so I was like, yeah, sure, Nuna, I can do that. So I signed the covenant, and my sister took it and whatnot. And so after spring break was done, I'm going back to school. I'm thinking, okay, I can get back onto my computer again. So I get back from school after spring break, and I rush to my computer in my room. And as soon as I turn on the power button, you hear the opening of Windows and stuff. And then my sister comes into my show, Josh, you're not allowed to be on the computer. And I was like, what are you talking about? Spring break's over. My covenant's done. I kept my word. I kept my end of the deal, right? And then she was like, no, Josh, this is during the season of Lent. And I was like, what the heck is a season of Lent? And she was like, it's 40 days. And I was like, until when? And she was like, Easter Sunday. And that was like another 3 weeks away. And I was like, the heck is this, right? And so I looked at the covenant again, and I read it more carefully, and I realized it said on there, you got to read covenants very carefully. It said the season of Lent. And I did not know about this. I believe I cried that day. Yeah, because I couldn't play Oregon Trail anymore. That was my game. But I think we kind of treat fasting like this today. Some of you guys, when you hear about fasting and you hear about Lent and you hear about, hey, we're going to hand out our fasting covenants to you guys next week, some of you guys might be like, oh, it's more of a punishment. Like I was just talking to some of your leaders earlier, but I don't know if you guys were there when we had were you guys there at the 30-hour famine? Yeah. Was that easy or hard? So hard. It was Brandon. So hard. It was wretched, man. I mean, we provided juice boxes for you guys, but it's difficult, right? I think a lot of young Christians today, we kind of think of fasting as a punishment. But in the Bible, you guys, that's not how the Bible describes what fasting is. Fasting is not a punishment. Another misconception of fasting among young Christians today is that sometimes we treat fasting like a New Year's resolution. I'm going to fast from unhealthy foods. I'm going to fast from social media. And you realize how cruel you're being to yourself and to your physical body, like a New Year's resolution. Most of the time, like most of us, the New Year's resolution then goes out the window, and we gain nothing from that New Year's resolution. It was maybe good for like a month or two, and then it just goes out the window. And fasting kind of is like that too. We do it, but what's the real benefit of fasting? Like, do you actually gain something from it? And this is why Pastor Phil and I, for this year's sermon series regarding the season of Lent, we decided to call it Detox. Because fasting, you guys, according to the Bible, it is not a punishment. It's a spiritual discipline. And as Christians, we have to practice these spiritual disciplines, because if we don't, it's near impossible to grow in our walk with Christ. It's near impossible to allow our faith to grow deeper in Christ. And this is what I kind of want to unpack for us this morning is, what is fasting? What is the purpose of fasting, and what does the Bible teach us about this? So, if you will open your Bibles with me to 2 Samuel chapter 12. 2 Samuel, all right? We're going to look at chapter 12, verses 15 to 23. Let me give you guys a little bit of a background, because this story spreads, and it begins from chapter 11, and then it goes all the way through chapter 12. So let me give you a bit of a background of what's going on. How many of you guys know about David's messed up story with Bathsheba and her husband Uriah? Raise of hands. Okay, good. All right. How many of you guys don't know about this? Okay, all right. So David is up one night, and he goes off to the roof of his home, and he's looking down at his kingdom. And as he sees this woman, a beautiful woman, and he tells his servants, "Hey, tell me about that woman. Who is she? Where is she from?" and so forth. And so they tell her that her name is Bathsheba. She is the wife of a Hittite named Uriah. And so King David hears about this. He knows that she has a husband, and King David, he can't control himself, right? This is one of his more darker sins, and so he says, "Bring Bathsheba to me." And so they bring her to him, and knowing that she's a married woman, David sleeps with her. Later, he finds out she's pregnant, and he's like, "Well, I don't want Uriah to find out about this." And so he thinks of this second plan, which isn't all that great of a plan. David tries to get Uriah drunk so that he would go back to his home, sleep with his wife, and then she would tell him the next morning, "Hey, I'm pregnant," and then he might feel, this is my kid, right? It doesn't work out. Uriah, after drinking with the king and whatnot, instead of going home, he stays near King David's house because his heart is to protect the king. Good guy. So then David devises a backup plan. And again, it just gets worse and worse and worse from here. He devises a backup plan where at the front of the battle lines, he decides to send Uriah out there, and he knows that Uriah has a high probability of dying on the front lines of the battlefield. And yet David commands his general, and he says, "Well, send Uriah the Hittite out there. Let him fight." And the commander, knowing the situation and what was going on, he puts Uriah out there, and he puts him in a position where Uriah would ultimately die. And so Uriah dies. King David hears about it. Bathsheba hears about it. She grieves for her now deceased husband. And King David, after she's done grieving, he says, "Well, come into my home, and I'll make you one of my wives." And so Bathsheba becomes one of King David's wives, and the child is born. It's a messed up story. It's pretty messed up. And here's the thing. After this whole incident happens, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 27, near the end of it, we're told this. If we can put that up on the screen. The thing that David had done displeased the Lord. The thing that David had done was displeasing to God. And so afterward, God sends a prophet named Nathan to David, and he says, "You need to rebuke my servant." So Nathan goes to King David and rebukes him through a story. similar to his own. And actually, just as a side note, how many of you guys watched VeggieTales growing up? Yeah. You guys remember the episode of King George and the Ducky? That's based off of this, okay? So just keep that in mind. If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's on YouTube. It was one of my most favorite episodes from VeggieTales, King George and the Ducky. But after rebuking David, Nathan goes home, all right? And then chapter 12 begins, right? Nathan goes home, or chapter 12, we're in the middle of chapter 12. Nathan goes home, and then suddenly, as a consequence of David's sin for cheating with Bathsheba, committing adultery, and then murdering her husband, God then afflicts David's child with Bathsheba with a fatal illness. And Nathan talks about this. And in verse 15, this is where we pick up. So this is what's happening now. In verses 15 to 17, let's read those verses together. This is what's going on, okay? In a loud voice. Then Nathan went to his house, and the Lord afflicted the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and he became sick. David therefore sought God on behalf of the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. And the elders of his house stood beside him to raise him from the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with them. David knew. He knew what he did was wrong. And the thing about it was that after one decision and another decision and another, it just got worse and it got worse and it got worse. Because he kept on pursuing his own desires. And ultimately, it now ended up where this child that was born out of this consequence, out of David's sin with Bathsheba, this child's life was on the line. And David couldn't let this child go. So rather than just accepting the consequences, David began to fast. And he began to pray to God, and he began to beg God, God, let this child live. If you will show your grace to me, let this child live. Is David being naive here? Is he being ignorant for hoping for this child to live, even though he knows that this is the consequence of his sin? I don't think so. As Christians, I don't think it's wrong for us to hope for an outcome. It's not wrong. And I say that because David lost a child, and when I lost my parents, when I was losing my dad, I was hoping and praying that God would heal my dad so that he would get to live just a little bit longer. Like I hoped in that, and that's not wrong. It's not wrong to hope in an outcome. The danger is this. The danger is when we allow the outcome that we desire to be our end goal. Does that make sense? The danger for us as Christians is when our hope in an outcome that we desire, when that outcome becomes our end goal, like that's all I'm living for, that's all I'm working for. If that becomes our end goal, then yes, hoping in that outcome is dangerous. And let me explain why. In order to understand this, I need to give you guys the opposite side of this. So let's read on from verse 18, 2 Samuel. Chapter 12, verses 18 to 23. We're going to read the rest of this passage. Okay? All right. So read with me in a loud voice. Ready? Begin. On the 7th day, the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead. For they said, Behold, while the child was yet alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to us. How then can we say to him, the child is dead? He may do himself some harm. But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, David understood that the child was dead. And David said to his servants, Is the child dead? They said, He is dead. Then David arose from the earth and washed and anointed himself and changed his clothes. And he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. He then went to his own house, and when he asked, they set food before him, and he ate. Then his servants said to him, What is this thing that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food. David said, While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live. But now he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. Do you see what's happening here? David's servants are perplexed. They are confused by David's actions. David was fasting for about a week because we're told that on the seventh day of David's fasting and his prayer, on the seventh day, since the child was sick, he died. And so for those 7 days or so, David was fasting and he was praying. And he refused to get any help from his servants. He refused to eat with his servants. And he laid on the ground in his room, constantly pleading to God, not eating, just fasting and just praying to God, God, let this child live. And so it got to the point where David's servants were like, oh man, if this child actually dies, King David, he might do something bad, like he might injure himself, right? But what happens? When King David finds out that his child is dead, what does he do? Gets up, washes himself, anoints himself, goes into the sanctuary of God, worships him, and then he goes home and he tells his servants, bring me some food. They bring him some food, and then he begins to eat and drink as if that incident 7 days prior, never happened. And the servants are like, what is this? Right? Is King David being cold? Like, is he being indifferent? Like, why all of a sudden when he was fasting and weeping and praying, is he now eating as if nothing happened? And here's the thing. David knew what he needed to let go. When I was reading about this passage, I thought a lot about my dad, and I'm telling you guys, if you ever come into that season in life where you have a loved one or a close person in your family pass away, it is hard to let them go. It is one of the hardest things I have ever had to let go. But David here, he knew what he needed to let go. And he struggled with it too. That's why he fasted and he prayed on behalf of his dying child. But when God's decision was made final and the child was pronounced dead, David knew, I need to let this child go because God's decision, his final outcome, that is more important. And he trusted in that, which is why, again, if you read with me again in verses 22 to 23, David says this. He says, while the child was still alive, I fasted and I wept. And he pleaded on behalf of the child to God. For I said, who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live. But now the child is dead. Why should I fast? And basically what David is saying here is, God has given me his answer, and I am okay with his answer because I trust in God's answer. If that is God's outcome, then so be it. I am okay with that. And a lot of times you and I, as growing Christians, this can be a hurdle for many of us. It was for me when my dad passed away. But this is what fasting is. Fasting is not a punishment, you guys. It is a spiritual discipline. It is a spiritual discipline for what? This is my first and my only takeaway for today. Fasting as a spiritual discipline teaches us to trust in God's outcome, not our own. Fasting as a spiritual discipline is supposed to teach us to trust in God's outcome, not our own outcome, not what we want. Fasting is supposed to teach us to hold on to and to hope in and to trust in God's outcome, whatever it may be. That is what fasting is. The point of fasting isn't to get what we want. The point of fasting is to seek God's outcome and to learn to trust in God's outcome. David was hoping for the child to live. But his hope in God's answer was greater than that. Which is why David in the Bible, in Acts chapter 13, verse 22, he is known as a man that chases after God's own heart. And this is what God says, man about whom God said, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything that I want. That is why David is known as a man after God's own heart. Because even God proclaimed about David, son of Jesse, this man will do everything that I want. And King David, if you ever read about his life through 2 Samuel, he's messed up many times, didn't live a perfect life. But at the end of all of his seasons in life, even the bad ones, he always ended up doing what would honor God and would glorify God. He always did that. Even at the very end of 2 Samuel, if you guys have ever read it, at the very end of 2 Samuel in chapter 24, David's life, it actually ends on a very sad note. Like you would think that everything is always a happy ending in the Bible, but it's not. David's life was actually it ended on a bit of a sad note where David again messed up. But ultimately at the end of 2 Samuel, if you read it, what does he do? God, I bring this offering to you. I plead before you. Put this on me, not on your people. And God then, he answers David's prayer. Not the greatest ending, but at least he ended, again, desiring whatever it was that God wanted. Gem Youth, this is what fasting is all about. Grade 12s, you have a school you want to go to. You have an outcome that you are working towards. Grade 11s, you have an outcome that you are working towards. What if that outcome doesn't happen? Will you learn to trust in God's outcome for your life? Probably at your guys' age, this is one of the hardest things to do, which is why probably today in the 21st century, amongst young Christians, fasting is no longer a practiced spiritual discipline. No one feels the need to fast to give up something for God anymore. Only as long as you're comfortable with whatever it is that you're giving up and it doesn't really penetrate into your personal life, that's your guys' generation right now. I'll give God just this much, nothing more, because I have this to take care of. I've got school, I've got education, I've got a career to work towards, I've got my own outcome to run towards. But Gem Youth, it's not about our outcome. It's about us aligning with God's outcome. Amen. It's about us aligning our lives with His good, pleasing, and perfect will for us.